One time, I stayed home alone, and I decided to invite my friend over for the night. I called her. "I'm coming over soon," she said on the phone, "but give me a moment." About half an hour later, I heard a knock at the door and the voice of my friend, Emily. "Open up, I'm freezing!" The voice trembled. I immediately recognized it as Emily's, as she had been reluctant to visit me due to the cold weather. I told her to wait a moment while I grabbed the keys. The voice behind the door kept repeating, "I'm freezing!" It got louder and louder with each repetition. I started to think she was joking, deliberately rushing me. However, just as I was heading toward the door, my phone rang. It was Emily. "Where are you going?" she asked. I stopped dead in my tracks. "To let you in," I answered. Her tone shifted to confusion. "But I'm not coming anymore. I decided to stay home." By this point, I was already at the door. My hand hovered over the lock. "Then who's outside?" I whispered, panic rising in my voice. For a moment, I was left alone. Just me and the voice at the door. The voice continued to repeat, "I'm freezing!" But now, it was no longer pleading. It was angry, almost growling. I wanted to look through the people, but couldn't gather the courage. Still, I leaned in and took a peek. What I saw is impossible to describe. Whatever stood outside that door could never imitate my friend's voice. It wasn't human, not even close. Suddenly, the voice stopped. Everything went quiet for a moment. No knocking, no muttering. I felt a momentary wave of relief, thinking it had left. But then came the scratching, a soft, deliberate scraping against the door, growing louder with every second. The sound twisted my thoughts, driving me into a blind panic. My hands trembled, and my legs nearly gave out. I slid down the wall, clutching it as though it were my lifeline. Then the scratching stopped. A different voice emerged, low, guttural, inhuman. "It's cold. Let me in." The voice sent chills down my spine. The door started shaking violently, as if something was pounding on it with inhuman strength. I sat paralyzed against the wall, unable to scream, barely able to breathe. The pounding grew louder, more frantic. Then, suddenly, silence. I don't know how long I sat there, trembling and crying. It felt like hours. Eventually, I noticed my phone in my hand. I unlocked it and saw a single blank message from an unknown number. I stared at the empty screen, my mind racing. My phone buzzed again. Another call from Emily. I flinched but answered it. "Emily?" I whispered. Her cheerful voice greeted me. "How are you?" "What's wrong?" Tears rolled down my face as I tried to explain what had just happened. She listened calmly and reassured me. "I'll come over," she promised. As we talked, I started to calm down. By the time she arrived at my building, I felt a little more grounded. When she rang the doorbell, I rushed to the door, eager to see her, to finally feel safe. But when I opened the door, it wasn't Emily. It was that thing. It stood there, holding my friend's lifeless body in its arms.
My father, a strong and sturdy man who had seen much in his long life, came home one night around 3 in the morning. When he stepped through the door, I barely recognized him. His face was as pale as a ghost. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to take off his shoes. And there was something on his face. Fear. Such a state was unusual for him. I might have expected it 7 years ago when he first started working at his current job. My father worked as a crematory furnace operator at the city's crematorium. Over the years, he had grown accustomed to the constant grief, tears, and death surrounding him. In the beginning, he often came home on the verge of tears. Over dinner, he would down a glass of vodka and tell us about cremating a child or about the grieving families he saw in the farewell room. What terrified him most was the observation window in the furnace, through which one could see the flames devouring the coffin. But eventually, even that became routine for him. However, that night was different. I was still awake and saw him in this strange state. "Dad, what happened?" I asked. He glanced at me briefly, took off his sneakers, and silently walked to the kitchen. "Everything's fine," he muttered without looking at me. But I could tell it wasn't. Hearing him moving about, my mother also woke up and joined us in the kitchen. "What's going on? Why are you so late?" she asked, half asleep. For a moment, my father didn't say anything, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Finally, he poured himself a full glass of vodka, drank it in one gulp, and began speaking. Today, a woman came to us. She had scheduled an appointment, all by the book. She wanted to cremate her daughter, a young girl, barely out of her teens. Life was just beginning for her. But the woman, she was strange. She kept rushing us, asking how to speed up the process, even offering money. I told her I couldn't help her, that we had rules to follow. Then she gave me this look. It was like I had ruined her entire life. She slammed the door on her way out, and we thought that was the end of it. My father paused, pouring another drink before continuing. By the evening, the paperwork was done, and the body arrived. The coffin, if you could even call it that, was a crude, wooden box. It smelled terrible, even though the girl was supposed to have died only the day before. When we opened it to confirm the identity, we found her body partially decomposed. Her legs and abdomen were covered in dark spots, and there was this liquid oozing out. He looked at both of us with a haunted expression. We loaded the coffin into the furnace and turned it on. But something strange happened. The fire wouldn't ignite. No matter what we did, the flames kept dying out. And then I saw her face. "Whose face?" my mother asked, her voice trembling. "The girl's." Her charred face appeared in the observation window, staring straight at me. But it wasn't just her. Something was wrong. Her hand moved. It wasn't normal. It was like she was alive. My father's voice broke. Her body wasn't burning. The fire kept going out. And then, in the window, I saw it. Not her. Something else. Something alive. He described a grotesque, burnt figure with no eyes, no mouth, just a smooth surface where a face should be. Its head was split down the middle, and from the dark seam crawled worms and insects. Ivanich, my co-worker, ran to the control panel and tried to turn the furnace back on. It started roaring, but the sound was unbearable. It was like a train's whistle, mixed with the screams of 1,000 souls. And then, the observation window shattered. My father's hands shook as he recounted the events. We ran. We didn't even think. We just ran. But it followed us. We hid in a storage room, barricading the door with anything we could find. I could hear its heavy, shuffling footsteps outside. And then I saw it again. Its head peered around the corner. He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. We escaped through a window, not even thinking about the fall. Ivanich sprained his ankle, but we kept going until we reached the main road and saw people. Only then did we feel somewhat safe. The room was silent as he finished his story. My mother looked horrified, but I noticed something strange about my father. His eyes darted nervously, and he kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting to see something. Later that night, as he showered, I passed by the pile of clothes he had left in the hallway. Something moved. I bent down and saw them, white maggots wriggling through the fabric. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the photo my father had shown me. A blurry image of the furnace's observation window, with a terrifying figure staring back at him. The next morning I woke up to the smell of smoke. The apartment was on fire. Flames engulfed my parents' bedroom. My mother was already gone, her body charred. My father, He was nowhere to be found. No body, no belongings, nothing. A few days later, I buried my mother at the same cemetery where my father had worked for years. I don't know what happened to him, but I have a feeling I know why that woman was in such a hurry to burn her daughter's body. Something dark, something evil had inhabited it, and when her body was reduced to ashes, that evil was released. Now I can't help but feel it's still out there, somewhere, maybe even in my father's body, waiting for its next victim.
I have always lived alone in a rented apartment. My job often forces me to stay up late, and that night was no exception. The summer breeze drifted into the room through a slightly open window as I worked at my computer, unaware of anything unusual, until I heard a strange rustling sound. At first I thought it was just the wind or some noise from the neighbors, but this sound was different. It grew louder. Soon it became clear that the noise was coming from the hallway, tapping. It sounded like someone was drumming their fingers on the door from the other side. A wave of primal fear washed over me. I couldn't move or even breathe. I wanted to get up and turn on the lights, but my body wouldn't respond. I just stared into the darkness at the door. And then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Fingers started sliding under the door, exploring its surface as if searching for a weak spot to push through. The hand disappeared, only to return moments later. This time, it was feeling around the floor. My heart raced like never before. I almost fell out of my chair. Then this thing began to gently push against the door from inside. Each push was accompanied by a scraping sound. I was frozen in my seat, unable to comprehend what was happening. Through the glass on the door, I strained to see who or what was on the other side, but there was nothing, just emptiness. The scraping grew louder and louder. My panic reached its peak. At last, I bolted upright, turned on the lights, and grabbed my phone. With shaking hands, I called my friend. His voice was calm but tinged with concern. He told me, "Pack your things and get out of there as soon as possible." But I couldn't bring myself to open the door. What if it was waiting for me in the hallway? I stayed awake all night, keeping the lights on and talking to my friend. Nothing else happened, but the fear lingered. At dawn, my friend said he was on his way to pick me up. I called him to make sure he was close and hurried to the front door. But when I opened it, there was no one there. To say I was terrified would be an understatement. I fled the apartment and sat outside the building, cursing the night and nearly in tears. 20 minutes later, my friend finally arrived and we drove to his place. I only returned to that apartment later with a priest, who blessed every room. Since then, nothing strange has happened. But even now, thinking back to that night sends shivers down my spine. I can't explain what it was, but now I truly believe there are things in this world that defy understanding.